Okay, well, hello everyone. It's 12:05 and time to get started. As many of you know, there were some internet difficulties last week, particularly in the Los Angeles area. So we're very pleased that we were able to reschedule this just a week later. Welcome once again to the UCCS Speaker Series, this week featuring Dr. Remot Mukhija from UCLA. As with most weeks, our aim at UCCS is to make policy-relevant evidence and science accessible to policymakers and the community through our speaker series, special panels and workshops, policy briefs, and a number of other means. UCCS builds bridges between UC students, UC researchers, and California state policymakers, and more information is always available at our website at uccs.ucdavis.edu. The subject today is informal housing, which is an interesting term since it has less to do with formality and more to do with being outside of government control or regulation. So we're talking about colonias, unpermitted trailer parks, garage apartments, and the like. And there's no one better positioned to address this topic than Remot Mukhija. He's professor and chair of urban planning at UCLA. He received his PhD in urban development and planning from MIT. After working as a professional architect and as a postdoctoral researcher for the Fannie Mae Foundation, he's devoted his academic career to identifying and improving strategies for increasing access to decent housing among the urban poor here in the US and abroad as a pathway to social and spatial justice. He's author of many academic articles and 2 books, most recently an edited volume entitled The Informal American City, Beyond Taco Trucks and Day Labor. A review in the Journal of Planning Literature exclaims, "The collection of essays is a strong introduction to the various forms of urban informality, from vending to parking to urban architecture. The resulting picture is one in which urban informality is neither ephemeral nor transient." Dr. Mukhija is also the winner of multiple teaching awards, and he served as an advisor to urban planning commissions, both here in the United States and in India. For all these reasons and more, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Mukhija to the virtual podium. Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, for that wonderful introduction. And my apologies, we had to move the presentation discussion from last week to this week, but I'm delighted we were able to find the time, and I look forward to sharing this research with you and discussing it a little bit at the end. So here's my topic, which is looking at informal housing in Los Angeles to get a sense of who benefits and who doesn't benefit from informal housing. In particular, I want to focus on informal housing in single-family units. And as Dr. Kravitz noted, I define informal housing as unregulated housing. So it's unpermitted and unregulated. And since single-family zoned land typically forms a majority of the zoned land in most American cities, it's interesting to look at informality that happens within these zoned parcels. And what I'm hoping to do is share with you the geography of single-family unpermitted housing, and then use that to think about its nature and policy recommendations. So here's my outline, where I'll briefly discuss the literature, focus mostly on the prevalence and distribution of informal housing in Los Angeles, and spend some time discussing the planning options. So here's a slide that has a lot of material on key pieces in the informal economy literature. And it starts with the work by Gillian Hart, where informality was seen as something very distinct from the formal sector, hence the term informal sector and the formal sector. Over time, we have come to realize that both informality and formality are intrinsically linked. They're part of the same socioeconomic system. They are linked through regulation. They're linked through the actors who are part of the informal economy and the formal economy. And it's very difficult rather, to think of something as entirely informal or entirely formal. And more recent literature on urban informality has helped focus on the role of governments. What can governments do to address the issue of informality? Typically, in planning, we think of informality as related to housing, as well as labor. In terms of housing, the general sense is it is linked to slums. And that is key work that follows in Mike Davis's Planet of Slums. In the US, there is less work on informal housing, but increasingly it deals with immigrants. That includes Peter Ward's work on colonias in Texas, work on immigrant suburbs, and work on gateway cities in LA that look at immigrant communities as being the key actors in informal housing. And finally, here's a set of key elements from the literature that talk about policy responses. These policy responses have included getting rid of informal housing or slum clearance, not interfering with slum housing or informal housing, and letting residents the freedom to build. And most dominantly, the idea of legalizing informality and allowing that to be more easily a part of the formal sector. And I have done work that looks at redevelopment as an alternative, that thinks of informality in housing being redeveloped and existing housing or residents of those informal units being part of the new housing. That was my work in Mumbai or Bombay, which has a program of redeveloping slums, but including replacement housing for residents of informal settlements in the new housing. Now, all of these policy options have some relevance, and they're all incomplete. So when I moved to Los Angeles with my experience of studying informal settlements in Mumbai, I was interested in exploring the idea of informal housing in the US. And as the literature suggested, this was something to be seen with immigrant communities. I focused on the farming communities that are east of Los Angeles, Riverside County, Imperial County, Eastern San Diego County. And I came across a trailer park called Duroville that was on Torres Martinez or Native American land. This is a trailer park that essentially housed farm workers who had wages that really were limited to $15,000 to $20,000 a year. Should I, Nicholas, is that a question? Should I take it right now? Oh, I have three.
If there are clarifying questions, I think that we take those now. But if there are actually questions as part of the presentation, then we do have a Q&A at the end.
So if you have a clarifying question, I'm happy to take it now. Do I still have a raised hand? Okay, then we can take these questions later. So these settlements, or this settlement in particular, was housing farm workers, and infrastructure was poor, but it included almost 300 of these trailer homes, and those residents had their subtenants. So this place had almost 3,000 residents, and this is a photograph from about 2004, 2005. It had many qualities that you find in informal settlements, like mixed land uses, residents improving their homes to the extent possible. Here you can see the tremendous care being taken to grow the grass, people making improvements for sitting on this little deck that has been done. So immense qualities that we find across the world in terms of trying to make what little people have a little better. The place had rules, and this became a case between the federal government and the Torres Martinez tribe, because it turned out the state had very little ability, state government of California, ability to interfere, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the EPA were involved in what was a very poor housing conditions in terms of wastewater as well as water infrastructure. So the idea was we had a federal intervention that suggested that Duroville could go into receivership, and the rent that was being collected could be used to improve the infrastructure conditions. Now, the rents for these lots of land were about $350 to $400 per lot per month, and there were almost 300 of those, plus there was some commercial land uses. So almost $1.5 million in rent was being collected in Duroville every year. However, there wasn't, what would have helped was money to come in and improve the infrastructure and later be repaid by those rents. So this is an aerial photograph of where you can see the layout of the lots. You can see some of the commercial uses on the west side, and you can get a sense of how big this place was. But after a few years of trying to improve it without investing enough to improve it, trying to improve it through the rents rather than big public investments, it was decided that this was the living conditions were too poor, and Duroville was cleared. This is a clearance in 2014. So this would match what we've typically seen as slum clearance and enforcement of regulations, rather than improving it through upgrading or legalization and public investment. And as I was studying Duroville, I also became aware of unpermitted housing much more closer to Los Angeles than in farm worker communities and on Native American tribal land. So this is a unit that one of my students lived in. It's an unpermitted garage apartment. The unit would move from one student to the other as students graduated. And you can see here are two photographs of the kitchen, which kind of neatly hides behind the door if necessary. But these are two students who had very different ways that they had arranged the kitchen space, you can see. But this, and I think this still persists as a unit that's rented by urban planning students at UCLA. So I was interested in better understanding unpermitted or informal housing in Los Angeles, not just a couple of hours away. And the main thing that I was interested in was how people were adding a second unit to single family zones, which I assumed was largely through garage conversions. As you can see in this photograph, this garage is not being used for parking cars. A while ago, or more than 35 years ago, the LA Times had done a study on unpermitted second units or garage conversions in LA. And they've sent their reporters to survey a good sample of garages and see how many were converted. And they found at that time of the 1.5 million homes in the county, their assumption was about 40,000 were converted, had garages that had been converted. And their emphasis was on two things. One, that these were unpermitted, illegal, and second, that they were garages. Plus, it was a lot of emphasis on immigrants being the key reason that garages were being converted, and a lot of, as happens in LA, unhappiness that cars were being parked on the street. So I was interested in exploring how this had changed, and I did this study about 7-8 years ago. And what I'm going to share with you is parts of that study, which is the 2012, as well as more recent work that looks at how the geography and nature of garages might be changing. So I was keen, and I thought I could study informality by looking at advertisements for single-family homes for sale. My assumption was that if people were selling their homes, it was likely that they would hint on the possibility of an unpermitted unit, because that would help them sell the home for a little more. It would suggest an opportunity for the new owners to have a rental property. I also looked at complaints, how data on complaints. Hi, Nicholas, do you have a question? Okay, I also wanted to look at data on complaints from the LA Department of Building and Services. And more recently, I repeated my idea of looking at real estate advertisements, because as many of you would know, since 2016, we have had a dramatic change of rules in the state of California to allow for accessory dwelling units, garages to be converted, and second units to be built on single-family zone lots. So these are the three things I was keen to look at, and let me go through them one by one. So for the real estate listings, I assumed that there would be clues in the listing that would suggest that there'd be an unpermitted second unit. And these were some of the words that we found as we looked through the listing. It was often things like the buyer might need to verify the permit, but more importantly, there was also a discrepancy between what was the official size of the unit, the square footage in the county assessor's data, and what the homeowners were advertising as the sale of their unit. And that discrepancy suggested a possibility of an unpermitted unit. Sometimes there were photographs included, and so on. So as we looked through those listings, they were at that time in the city of LA about a little less than 500,000 single-family homes. 3,000 or so were on sale. Actually, there were 5,000 on sale, but if you might recall, they were around 2011-12, tremendous amount of foreclosure homes were being sold, and many of the homes that were being sold through foreclosure didn't have photographs. So we removed those from the sample, focused only on the listings that had photographs and details about the property so we could identify clues. And in that sample, about 5.5% had an unpermitted unit. So 5.5% extrapolates to about 25,000 single-family homes in the city of LA likely had unpermitted second units. But I had seen a study in the city of San Francisco where the planning department had tried to estimate the number of unpermitted units by two ways. One, by looking at real estate listings, and second, by actually doing field surveys in the neighborhoods. And they found that when they went out and surveyed the neighborhoods, they found twice as much the number of unpermitted units than what they found on the real estate listings. So my assumption is that several homeowners might not advertise an unpermitted unit. There might be unpermitted units that are more ad hoc, that are not in better condition, that should be advertised. So I assume that instead of 25,000, it's likely that the city of LA, within almost 500,000 single-family houses, about 10% rather than 5.5% would have a second unit. So that's my sense of estimate of what's the likely number of unpermitted second units. I was interested in seeing where were these units? Were they only in the immigrant communities of LA, or were they spread all across the city? So this on the left is a map of the various 7 area planning commissions in the city of LA. And on the table in the right, you can see there's considerable variation in the median home list price. That home list price is very high because, as I mentioned, it's only single family homes, and we removed all the homes that were for foreclosure. And there is relatively less variation in the number of second units. It ranges from 3.3 to about 7.4. So, and you can see that some of the poorer neighborhoods don't necessarily, poorer immigrant-rich neighborhoods don't necessarily have more unpermitted second units than some of the richer ones like West LA and South Valley or Central LA. I was also interested in looking at the typology of the second units, because if you remember from the LA Times article, there was a lot of emphasis that these were garages being converted. I was surprised to see that if I looked at the typology of second units in my sample from the real estate sale, a lot of what was informal was detached construction, a second unit in the backyard, which was also key in the formal unit. So this is a sample of, if you remember, there were 160 unpermitted, 68 unpermitted units, and about 46 were formal. And these were formal because these were grandfathered units rather than units that had received permission. So these are older units before zoning and before zoning changes. So that's what made them formal. Here's a little bit on the conditions and what I was curious what kind of conditions one can expect. So this was a photograph that was included in the real estate listing. It showed how a toilet could be hidden behind a closet door. This is a kitchen that was one of the real estate listings, very high quality, as you can see. Here is a kitchen that was done in some field work by my research assistants, and this kitchen is much more precarious. So there is tremendous amount of variation in these conditions. Here is a garage that we also came across in the field work, and you can see from the front, it still looks like a garage, but in the back, there is an unpermitted unit. So it's a little more hidden from the street. There's the wiring, electric wiring is a little risky, it's jerry-rigged. So this is looking at the complaints data in contrast to the sales data. And what struck me in this was there seems to be, one, the number of complaints is not that high compared to how many it looks like the number of informal units that exist. And secondly, there is a lot more variation across these 7 area planning commissions about the number of complaints. So take for example, South LA. South LA has 14% of the single family homes, but 26% of the complaints. West LA has almost 14% of the single family homes, but only 6% of the complaints. Now this could be because housing conditions are much better in the West LA informal units, which is the wealthier neighborhood, or there's a lot more acceptance. So but there is a lot more variation and unevenness in the complaints as opposed to the number of informal units. So in this slide, I've tried to compare the informal units, the share within the area planning commissions, and the complaints, and again, this becomes even more striking. West LA has a lot more percentage of informal second units, almost 20% of their units, but the complaints again are much less. So again, I was puzzled about why is there a variation in this? You can see again, North Valley, the percentage of informal units is much less, but the complaints are much higher. And the opposite in Central, which is a wealthier part of Los Angeles. So one possibility might be that because what you see here is people tend to complain more about garage conversions than backyard units, even though backyard units are much more prevalent among the informal housing. The complaints here you see are predominantly about garages. And this might be that certain neighborhoods, they have smaller lots, there are poorer families, they are more likely to convert the garage than have the ability to build a backyard unit in the backyard. So this might start explaining some of the variation why we see more complaints in the poorer parts than the more wealthy parts. Now, as I mentioned, in 2016 onwards, we had a significant change in the rules for building accessory dwelling units in California. These were bills that were led by Assemblymember Bloom and Senator Bob Wieckowski, and they've had other follow-up legislation that has made it much more easier to build second units. And City of LA has led that boom in permits for second units, formal second units. So as one would expect with that legalization, there should be some change in the prevalence of unpermitted units in the city. So here, if I compare the 2012 data with the 2019 data, the percentage of informal units has dropped from 5.5% to about 3.5%. However, if you look at by area planning commission, the big drops have been in West LA, which is wealthy, in South Valley, which is wealthy, as opposed to the poorer parts, South LA and North Valley, where in fact the percentage of informal housing has increased. Now, East LA is interesting. It is a less affluent immigrant part of the city, but the drop has been, there has been a drop, and that might indicate gentrification, which is a key issue in East LA. So again, this is sort of looking at how formal units are becoming prevalent in certain parts, but less so in the less affluent parts. And I think what this suggests is the changes in rules have helped in reducing informality, as would be expected, but the changes in rules have helped the wealthier parts of Los Angeles more than the less affluent parts. And we also see a shift in the typology. Now, informal housing that's left is more likely to be a garage conversion than a detached backyard unit. And those backyard units, maybe because they are easier to formalize, maybe because they again indicate a lot more wealth for homeowners, those are becoming formal instead of unpermitted. So this, I think, gives a bit of a sense of, one, that informal housing is very common. Second, it used to be equally common across rich and poor parts of LA, although there were more complaints in less affluent neighborhoods, probably perhaps because of conditions, maybe because of the garage conversions being dominant. And with the changes in rules, as we see a lot more, it's easier to build a second unit. Informality has reduced in the more affluent neighborhoods of LA, but it continues to be a challenge in less affluent. So what should policymakers and planners do about that? It seems to me that there are two options. One is, again, revisiting what the rules are, what is legal, what is unpermitted. And second, active strategies to improve living conditions within existing informal housing or upgrading of informal housing. Let me go through these one by one. In terms of legalization, a lot of our emphasis has been on the role of the state. The state has played an important role, and without the state intervention, I don't think we would have this boom in accessory dwelling units. But I think the local governments need to be pushed to also change their rules based on local conditions. This is an attempt that the city of LA had for accessory dwelling workshops in 2009. As you can see, it's a limited number of workshops for a city of 4 million people. We need a lot more of those, and that's the only way public opinion can be changed. This is sort of anti-accessory dwelling unit coverage by Progressive Weekly in LA. And we need a lot more of these pilot projects that the city of LA has been doing. And the idea behind some of this local initiatives would be to understand what our conditions on the ground are in various neighborhoods of a city. This is a projects that my students did in the neighborhood of Pacoima in Northeast Los Angeles, or the North Valley. And you can see these lots have a tremendous variation of the kind of unpermitted units. These are all zoned for single family, but there are many different kinds of configurations of accessory dwelling units, informal housing. Sometimes they're 2 units, sometimes they're 3. So unless we understand what these conditions are, and we have rules at the local level that allow for legalizing them, it won't be enough to have state frameworks that address these very specific local conditions. Here's an example from Vancouver, where they have, and I don't know if you can see from this photograph, what is odd about this photograph is this is a secondary suite in Vancouver, and it shows a ceiling height of 6 feet 6 inches. And that is the legally allowed height for a unit to be receive permits. And they went with 6 foot 6 inches because they realized that most of the secondary basements that existed were only 6 feet 6 inches. And if they decided that the minimum height was any more, it was unlikely that owners of these units would invest in them, try to improve them, or even get permits. So I think we need a little bit of local initiatives on what these legalization frameworks and sets of rules are. And these would vary. They would be different in Sacramento and different in Los Angeles. We also need a lot more public investment in improving some of this housing. We need money to remove risks. We need some enforcement action. We need assistance to homeowners that helps improve them, some permits that allows them to invest, and loans and grants that really, if it is not a family with resources, they will need financial support to improve those housing. And if that housing isn't improved, then either we end up with housing that is in poor condition, or we end up with housing that will disappear through redevelopment. So I think in addition to the legalization, we need a lot more investment in existing informal housing, which I know is, as the state looks at a budget crisis, it seems very difficult, but a complete reliance on the market to address the issue of informality is not going to help some of the families that need the most help. That's it. I think I am ready to take questions and answers, and I'm not sure if I should stop sharing the screen and follow another format, but I will let someone guide me on that.
Yes, you can just go ahead and leave the screen up there. And for anyone who would like to go ahead and ask questions, if you could just go ahead and raise your hand, and then Sandra Wilson in our office will go ahead and call on you, and she'll unmute you.